filling the promised land, this was a problem. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and the Astartes, or another word, or Ashtaroth is another way of saying that. So early on, the temptation to worship these Canaanite gods was a real problem. And all of the religious leaders of Israel wrestled with this problem throughout all the decades. And like I say, the main issue was fertility. How did things reproduce? And Baal and Ashtaroth were gods that were prayed to help the land produce, and for children to be born, and all of that. And so fertility became the big issue that Jay was concerned about as he is writing in this time of around the 900s, because we encounter Solomon. Now, Solomon, as you might know, the son of David, was an incredible king. He expanded the land of Israel to its greatest glory, and it has never seen it since. From all the way to Egypt, clear up to north towards where Turkey would be, clear out to the Euphrates River. Solomon ended up commanding a huge territory. And this is incredible given the fact that Solomon's grandfather was a shepherd. And Israel virtually didn't exist as a nation. It was just a tribe in amongst other tribes there. But Jesse's son, David, conquered the land and set up, created Jerusalem and all that. And then Solomon just took it to even greater heights. And of course, one of the things that Solomon was able to do that David wasn't able to do was to build the temple. David wanted to build a temple, but wasn't. In fact, I think there's a story where it says God told him you're not going to be able to do that. Bathsheba, I think, had something to do with that. Bathsheba. So Solomon gets to build the temple. And so Solomon was considered to be a great, great king. Except Jay and his cohorts were not impressed with Solomon's accomplishments. Because, you see, Solomon got engaged in foreign affairs, if you will. Not political and sexual. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. And here we have a famous painting, there's many of these, where Solomon is receiving the Queen of Sheba, who comes to him, and eventually he takes her as his wife, along with hundreds of others. Many wives and concubines did Solomon have. And unfortunately, according to the religious leaders, Solomon allowed these foreign wives to influence him in his religious practices, because they brought their religious practices with them, and Solomon wanted to honor them, so he allowed them to build temples to these other gods and worship other gods. And this is a painting showing that when he was in his old age, he too started worshiping these other gods. And they really did wear clothes like that in Solomon's time. So the Jay, the Yahwist, sees all this and is very concerned because This is basically the conclusion that, and this is actually in your notes if you want, this text. King Solomon loved many foreign wives, foreign women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods." Solomon clung to those in love. When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Then the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this matter, that he should not follow other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord commanded. This is the indictment on Solomon. A little aside. He was not indicted for having many wives. He was indicted for having foreign wives. Interesting note. Never was he condemned or criticized for having more than one wife. He had lots of them. It was the foreign wives who led him to worship other gods. That was the problem. So as Jay is assessing this situation and looking at what's going on and basically pretty upset with what he sees, with what Solomon has done to abuse his authority as the king of Israel, Jay tries to figure out what the problem is. And Jay's assessment of the problem is civilization itself. Now you might say, why? Well, that's what we're going to be looking into. But it's in a very real way, Jay's story of creation is a critique at civilization. Now, for P, that wasn't a problem. For P, they lived in Babylon, they were in exile in Babylon, and there's places in the prophets where it talks about, settle in and make your home there in Babylon, there in the, while they were in captivity. But P's world would be kind of in that sense fairly modern, and it was urban. They lived in the city. It was agricultural. They tilled the land. In other words, it was very, very civilized. And nothing in the first chapter that we read criticizes any of this. In fact, it basically accepts it and adopts it. There isn't any sense that they should be, that P was critical of the civilization that they were part of, just the fact that they were polytheistic and believed in other gods. And in fact, in some of the ways, the way that P writes his story is sort of comes out of an imperial kind of mindset. God declares and it happens kind of thing. It's an imperial kind of command, which was what they had grown up with in being in imperial Babylon. This was not Jay's ideal, because Jay's ideal world was pastoral and nomadic, like Abraham. So in a way, he pined for the days when life was simple and they were a wandering tribe in the desert, nomads, their sheep and their goats and their camels, whatever, wandering around and making life that way. So in a sense, even the idea of farming, settling down and making a farm, was almost too civilized. And you'll see, and as we go into the later chapters, temptations that come up, Jay kind of brings these to light as different situations come up where agriculture and living in the city and all of the things that come with urbanization, there are implied criticisms. Now I have to admit that for us who live in this incredibly urban city of San Francisco, this seems almost silly to say that the ideal world should be pastoral and nomadic. So in some ways, this is even a harder stretch for us to wrap our heads around as we read this story than it was for P, which was at least a little bit more urban and sophisticated. But sense, this is where Jay is coming from as he writes his story. But again, the issue of this creation story is, where does fertility come from? And his basic premises is that life, fertility, does not come from Baal or Ashtaroth. This is a carving of Ashtoreth. Life or fertility only comes from God. So Jay's story of creation makes that abundantly clear. That is what he's trying to say, is don't look to Baal and Ashtaroth and other Canaanite gods. Only God, Yahweh, brings fertility and life. One of the things that's interesting about this is just the very word fertility. Because what fertile means, good soil. And yet it's actually applied to women bearing children. And so, just so you know, so the operating scientific understanding, if you will, that wasn't a scientific understanding, but the operating principle by which people understood how children were made was at this time in history, was that men deposited the seed into the fertile soil of the woman's womb. The woman didn't actually contribute anything to the actual being, just provided the place for that. So it was definitely very male, which is interesting because early on, prehistory, there wasn't any understanding that men contributed anything whatsoever, and that all life came through women, and so all of life was, so it's interesting. So in a patriarchal society, it was the man's seed that then, so the only time you hear about women and the genealogies and all that kind of stuff is when they were barren, when they were unfertile. So fertility is kind of the issue. So let's take a little look then at how these creation stories compare, to give you an idea of one, the contrast between them, as we look at how Jay's approach to it. Now, last week I used the word cosmogony to describe the cosmological way of and in reality, that is how the universe is organized. I wouldn't say that Jay's account is a cosmology. It's sort of a mythological story about creation, but it doesn't concern itself with how the universe is ordered, just how life happens. So notice some of the differences. In P's account that we looked at last week, there's a different order of things. Vegetation is on day 3, and the sun and moon stars on 4, and birds and fish on day 5, and then land animals and humans on day 6. But in Jay's account, the sun and moon and stars are kind of presupposed. Therefore, it seems like they're there before the vegetation happens. Adam is created before both plants and animals in Jay's account. And then Eve is created after the vegetation and animals. So there's just a different order of things. And then there's different problems that they're addressing. In P's account, how water is treated is that there's too much water. So it begins with watery chaos and the problem of separating the waters and above and waters below and carved out by the land and all this. There's too much water that needs to be controlled. That's the chaos that we talked about. In Jay's account, there's not enough water. First, there's just dry land, then water is then finally introduced, and the barren earth needs water in order for vegetation to occur. So the problem is, from a fertility kind of point of view, that there's not enough water. And then again, different settings, life settings. In P's account, it's agricultural and urban, reflects the living situation of the great civilization of Babylon, abundance of water, living in a floodplain, the Euphrates and the Tigris, and then of course so the water is always an issue of of flooding in that region. But in Jay's account, It's pastoral and nomadic, and it reflects the living situation of wandering shepherds and the absence of water in the desert. So, whereas it's watery chaos for P, it's desert chaos, if you will, for J. And so what happens with this is that we find that also P and J have different ideas about order and randomness. Order is very, very important for the priestly writers. They're priests, after all. And they're very concerned about things being in order. So, so acts of creation are carefully planned and precisely executed. Movement from day to day is very deliberate and methodical. The phenomenon arranged symmetrically, logical progression, if not scientific or historical, at least logical. There's an intellectual element to it. The ascent accumulates in humans who crown the creation. The chaotic elements are contained and controlled, and the result is a stable cosmos, everything in its proper place. And so this creation story affirms a divine order, a plan, and a purpose for everything. In some ways it's masculine. Values of power and sovereignty, of imperial commands being given by the Creator over the created. And so there's an analogy of imperial rule and command, and it has kind of a high view of civilization. J is, he's just all over the place. And it's kind of like, okay, an obscure reference, but in Bernstein's Mass, the celebrant is singing this one song, and he sings this one, and he's talking about doing the Mass, and he says, we'll make it up as we go along. Well, in a way, that seems to be what God is doing in Jay's account. So there's kind of more drama and give and take. It's kind of like a divine experiment, if you will. Creative events seem to be response to new situations. And then later, God seems to regret them. It seems to be more about feeling and will, choosing and desiring and acting and reacting. There's just more give and take here. Man is made from the dust, earthly, not too far removed from the animals who are also made from the dust. And in some ways you have to learn to live with the chaos. That's just what happens when you live out in the desert wandering around. So the cosmos is somewhat capricious and random, and you just have to learn how to live with it. And in some ways, it's a little bit more feminine. The creation image is softer, if you will. I don't know if that's an arbitrary kind of thing, but there just seems to be more of a fertility kind of approach to things. And then this metaphor of potter and clay that comes through is this idea that God is molding things out of as an artist would. And then finally, Jay is very suspicious of civilization. Its aggressiveness, its acquisitiveness, its questions of knowledge and power. Throughout Jay's account, as we will see in coming chapters, Jay is always questioning that kind of approach to civilization. He's very suspicious of civilization. So let's look at this account. Now, I've given you the full account, but I've also kind of done some teasers. But a question.
Just I've forgotten. What's the time difference between J and P's writing, and also how were their different accounts considered down to the time they merged them or integrated them?
Okay, so we're about 300 years apart, 900, 600s.
Okay.
And how that Jay's account was used before the priestly writer, the priestly writer is the one that organized it. So they took Jay's account, added their own, edited it, sort of shaped it. And so we don't know anything about in between, because all we know is what the priestly writers came up with at final. Right. The only reason that, again, why we're able to even separate this out is that careful scholarly study looking at the differences in writing style that are pretty apparent, but you have to, be looking at it. So, okay, so about 300 years apart. Yeah.
Where does Moses fit in as to the order of writing?
Okay, I'm going to suggest that Moses didn't have anything to do with writing Genesis. That this is actually written, the account we're looking at was written at 900, probably 600 years after Moses. And that the priestly account was written 600, so Moses was about 1500. No, I take it back. Moses was about 1200. Abraham is usually dated around 1500 BC. I'm pulling this off out of deep recesses of my mind here. And Abraham was I think around 1200, 1300. And then, I'm sorry, Abraham about 1500, Moses about 1200. I might be lost on that. But I would say, I would say Moses didn't have anything to do with the writing of Genesis. So here we go. Land was barren, no vegetation whatsoever. No plant of the field was yet on the earth, the Lord God had not caused it to rain yet. And there was no one to till the ground. So right from the very beginning, there's this concern about who's going to tend to the fertility of the soil. Who's going to make this land produce? And so that seems to be the chaos that's being addressed here. But it does say that in the next verse that there seemed to be a steam that rose from the earth. How or where this idea came from, we don't know, but it's there. And maybe there were enough thermal things around that they could observe that there was steam that came out of the ground in various places around the world, in the region. I don't know. I think this is Yellowstone. I don't think they.
Question here.
Looking for steam. Yes.
In our printout, it says a stream would rise
Yes.
from the earth. So is it stream or steam?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's supposed to be steam.
Okay.
Steam would rise from the earth. Yeah. Pretty big difference in that.
I like that, though.
But what's interesting is this idea of steam coming from the earth will play out later in some of the explanations for how the flood happened. That's a couple weeks from now when we talk about the flood. And then it goes on to say that the Lord God. So it hasn't started raining yet, or maybe it does rain. Eventually, God causes it to rain. But out of the dust of the earth, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. This is a famous statue. Obviously, a focus on part of this famous statue of God creating man out of a clump of clay. And so Adam is created. Adam just means being. That wasn't actually his name, but it's the word to describe who he was. And so God creates Adam and then puts him in a garden. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So it's almost like, okay, so there's all this dry, dusty ground around. God allows the rain to come, and then he says, well, we need somebody to till the ground, so let's create a being to do that. So he creates man out of the dust, and then he says, well, he has to have someplace to live, so he creates the Garden of Eden, somewhere in the east. And there he put the man whom he had formed. So there's Adam in the garden, and the garden was a very nice garden. Every tree that is pleasant in the sight and good for food, the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This tree isn't any one of those. It's just such a pretty tree that but it was pleasant for sight. It was a beautiful place that God created for the for the man to live in. And there were these two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge of good and evil will kind of come into play next week when we encounter the serpent. But it's interesting that in this garden, a river is said to flow out of Eden. And then in your account, it actually then names 4 rivers. And one of them is the Tigris. So somehow, in his idea of it, this Garden of Eden existed someplace there in the region. You would not believe how many websites there are devoted to identifying the location of the Garden of Eden. It is incredible. Because if we could find out where the Garden of Eden was, then that'll prove that it's true. But that seems to be really so from a literalist point of view, you should be able to find this place. But we're talking mythologically, so good luck on finding the source of the Garden of Eden. And isn't it interesting how many literary themes have come out of this? East of, East of Eden, although that's after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, and then they live outside the garden. But there's a book called "The River Flows Out of Eden." So here's Adam. Here's the man in this beautiful garden. I know this picture shows Eve too, but she doesn't exist yet. But Adam is lonely. The man is there all by himself, taking care of this garden. And so the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper as his partner." Now right away you'd be thinking, "Oh yeah, that's Eve." But no, not yet. So out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And then we have the naming of the animals. And Adam got the privilege of naming all the animals. And this is a woodcut of Adam naming all of the animals. But it's kind of like God is saying, "Oh man, he's all by himself. That's not good. He needs some companionship. I'm going to make some animals." And so we have all the animals that are made as part of to help Adam not be lonely anymore. However, that wasn't enough, because the animals were not the same as the man. And so they did not provide the same kind of companionship that the man needed. And so God says, "Okay, let's see what else we can come up with." And he causes Adam to fall asleep, and out of one of the ribs he creates Eve, the mother of all living things. To me, it's just incredible how this story kind of seems to make things up as it goes along, or at least say it's a God who seems to be experimenting with creation, and realizes that if man is to thrive, if human beings are to thrive, there needs to be these certain things that are in place. So Eve is formed, and when Adam wakes up, he is elated. He is ecstatic. I mean, the language is, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." This is an exclamation, if you will, of discovery and joy, that here is somebody who is part of me. And so we have the first man and the first woman, and they lived in the garden. Let me say a couple things about Adam and Eve. Again, there's nothing to indicate that Adam and Eve actually physically lived as the